We just wanted to introduce Forbes Elworthy, who generously helped make this conference possible, actually. And he's going to give a bit of food for thought. We thought we'd label it over lunch. Kudos if you got the fun. But Forbes is a really impressive entrepreneur. He's worked in the agriculture space, especially for a long time. He started this really interesting concept, business map of agriculture. He's going to talk a little bit about his career and what he thinks. He's going to pose some questions actually for us as young professionals and as seasoned entrepreneurs in some cases, and as interested people in climate change on how we can do best going forward. So without further ado, Forbes.
I couldn't resist putting a few slides together with a few thoughts, but I'll try and go through them very quickly, just to get a few thoughts out there. The really good achievement is if the current scholars in the room and also quite a lot of the alums that are in the room, if we could get some discussion going around, how do you reconcile the many difficult issues of having a career where you're pursuing two objectives. You're trying to be solvent, you're trying to stay alive economically, and you're trying to also do good. And I think that's perhaps the core definition of social entrepreneurship. Broadly defined, I mean, somebody working in academia, somebody working in business, somebody working in government. So I picked out 4 difficult issues, and I'm going to suggest not perhaps solve the problems of, for example, the tragedy of the commons at this lunch, but to suggest some reading that I've found useful, actually business-type reading, not academic literature. So on the one hand, my project will solve environmental problems and also make money for you, the investor, is the classic phrase of the green energy entrepreneur or the social entrepreneur or the climate change entrepreneur. However, we all know that statement should probably be accompanied by, there are risks in execution of this project, and this is what they are. So as you go into your life as a social entrepreneur, how do you balance those risk disclosures with the glorious claims that you make? And here I would recommend, actually, in a reasonably formal way, which I did fairly late in my career, learning to sell. For many years, I slightly despised that concept. And I was a trader. Somebody else does the sales. But when I was the founder of a nearly dead software company that kept failing to close deals, mostly because I was talking too much at meetings. I was kind of yabbering away. I actually found myself desperately in the middle of the night reading a really painful sort of airport book called What They Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School. And actually, what I discovered that there's some actual techniques to conveying information, which most university professors have learned over many years, right, Cameron? Which is to get over your natural diffidence and pausing, a great meeting is a meeting where 60% of the talking came from the person that you're talking to, that you're selling to. And of course, the Rhodes community's produced a lot of great advocates. You've got to put your audience in a position where it can choose rather than sort of forcing things down their throats. And you've also got to balance enthusiasm with integrity to win trust. The other way, I think, to learn how to sell is to find a mentor. And I think your mentor won't find you. You have to find somebody that you'd like to learn from and just go to them and say, could you be on the board of my company? Could you help me? Could you come to meetings? The second, that was the longest one. The second thing that I think as a social entrepreneur one has to reconcile, and anybody concerned about an ethical issue like climate change. So we share with the rest of our race local imperatives. And as you get more senior in your career, you'll find legal imperatives like I'm a fiduciary for a company. Do I have the right to spend 3% of profits each year on planting trees? what Bridget and I found useful is just to start to make some commitments to ourselves and our businesses with our investors, just to make certain lines in the sand as to what we do. And I think there's another solution to the question of discipline and the problem of localism versus the global problem, and that is to make, to bear witness. I think for the October reunion at my business school in the States, I just said, well, I'm not going to make it a nation because you're not doing anything about climate change, and they've just put it on the agenda. So I think you've got to make a fuss. Actually, I have a book for all the other 3 problems, but I don't know if it's the Bible, but has anybody got a book that they can recommend about how to bear witness and to deal with self-discipline? Obviously, there's not much literature out there on that topic. So.
I do. John Lewis's books, the Congressman John Lewis on the civil rights leader, is about bearing witness and talking about the challenges you face and being sort of fearless and just taking them on. He was nearly beaten to death at 22 and walking over the Selma Bridge and is now in Congress. And he's an example of how he had as much or more impact at 22 as a student than members of Congress have now. But that sort of fearlessness and being grounded is something for him. It's faith and civil rights, but it is about something that matters, and you need to lose your fear because that matters more. To bear witness. To
What's the name of some of his books?
I will look them up.
I'll tell you what, we'll circulate these papers, and if you give that to me, I'll add it. And it could be as important as something dangerous or as something as relatively minor as the choice of car that you drive.
There's a powerful book, small book, easy to read, written by a theologian called The Wounded Healer.
Oh, Henry Nouwen.
Yes, Henry Nouwen, the Dutch theologian who lived for many years and worked at Harvard and elsewhere.
Could you give that to me, and I'll add that to. So the fourth thing as a social entrepreneur that one is aware of is this problem of identifying big goals in a world where people are very immediate. There's actually some outstanding business literature on this topic. Jim Collins wrote an outstanding book called Good to Great, a very empirical work on achieving what he called big BHAGs. And he identified statistically the sort of leadership that consistently achieved some of these big goals. And there's another book which is very, very consistent. It's just written about the Amazons and the Facebooks. Finally, we've got a very big BHAG that we've met this weekend to talk about. So not just in one's own life, which we talked about earlier. And I believe that this generation of human beings is in touch with a particular technology that has a chance to internalize externalities, that has a chance to begin to resolve something that just looks too big for any one human being or any one company or any one country. Platforms are rapidly transforming microeconomics. The sort of Michael Porter book from the Bible of all the MBAs from the 1980s, Competitive Strategy, is basically needs to be rewritten. And the reason is that there were always natural monopolies, maybe 5% of the economy, 10% of the economy. But indexing and algorithmically manipulating everything, which is what's happening on platforms, means that many, many spheres of human interaction are just naturally monopolistic in the way they're going to be resolved. An outstanding book on this topic is Modern Monopolies. These authors point out that only one of the top 10 companies in America 10 years ago, Microsoft, was a platform. 7 of the top 10 companies in America are now platforms, and it's only going to increase, and the statistics are the same in China. And this is the last slide. No doubt, the rapid spread of what is a naturally monopolistic social phenomenon is going to challenge many aspects of society. But for our purpose today, actually, having, for example, 4 billion people worldwide on smartphones starts to provide the beginning of a thought pattern about how we can all be in one place. I took the opportunity slightly to get a bit theoretical, but I and I guess some of the other alums that are here would very much be keen to take any questions about, how does one deal with the issues of social entrepreneurship? I really worry that social entrepreneurship, which I've been involved in with a company called Craigmore Sustainables that has done a lot of carbon forestry and some farming, I really worry that social entrepreneurship is itself very nascent in its microeconomic foundations. We don't have much theory yet. And here at Rhodes House, I'm thrilled that there's a lot of social entrepreneurs starting to emerge. But I just really hope that we'll send you out into the world properly equipped for what is actually some quite complicated issues. If there's no questions, I'll be able to.
Thanks for your talk, Forbes. I was just wondering what you thought of Claire's point this morning about how we can't be incrementalists, we have to be radicals and fundamentally change the economic system. Because it seems like social entrepreneurship is sort of more of the tinkering, incremental side of things rather than the big, change the whole economy, stop using resources, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, I would tend to agree with her. I mean, that's the question you've asked me isn't the topic of my talk. But I would tend to agree with her that we need radical change. At the same time, I just think, all human beings have to do their best at any one time. And all you can do in life is do your best. Just to give you a personal example, I sold a software business 10 years ago and thought about going into politics when, actually what happened to me was I was ignorant of climate change and the environment, although my mother's always been an environmentalist. I worked very hard in my career and family and sort of neglected reading, really. And then I had a couple of years to do some reading after I sold that business. And I decided climate change was a big issue that I wanted to spend most of the rest of my life working around. So at that point, I went and saw some friends and said, should I go into politics? Which I completely agree with her is a more direct way to deal with the issues at hand. But most of my friends said, Forbes, you're too old to go into politics. I was just turning 45, I'm 54 now. And they said, look, by the time you've got into cabinet, you'll be in your 60s. This is a television industry, You guys need to go into politics, helped by people like me, not people like me. I don't look good enough. And so I thought, well, what can I do? So I decided to build a business called Craigmore Sustainables, which would invest in farming and forestry and try to do that in the right way. So one does one's best.
This is also not exactly on the topic of your talk, so I hope that's okay. So you mentioned the natural monopoly that's kind of being created out of these platforms. So I was wondering if you could speak to how you see these platforms creating change in the climate change space. And is there any ways that you see the platforms being able to be used to help internalize some of the externalities of this tragedy of the commons and of the climate change issue?
I was hoping to ask that question of you. But I see it as a huge opportunity. I think some of these, rampant monopolies are going to have to be regulated. And I see in that regulation significant opportunities. I also think that if you go back 250 years, you have in periods of extraordinary inequality, and that is a period we are now in. And if you read Piketty, who's, I think, correct, and this looks like it's only going to increase. But they have been, if you look at the Whig leadership of this country 250 years ago, there was extraordinary privilege, but there was actually a high degree of social responsibility among that privilege. And I think that's something that gives thought to the sort of privilege that's represented in this room, educational privilege.
But it's fascinating, Forbes, that you think about the people who control these, you call them platforms, businesses that enjoy increasing returns to scale. Therefore, every additional member is an even bigger increment of value. Very few of those people have demonstrated any sort of, at least so far, sense of social responsibility as philanthropists or as other kinds of shapers. If you look at the owners of most of those businesses,
Yeah.
there have been some promises, Zuckerberg's promise, but very little follow-up.
Ted Turner gave $1 billion to the United Nations 15 years ago. It was pretty special, but we haven't seen enough of that, and that's perhaps a thought as well for this community.
So you've given us some starting points for thinking about how to drive change. And I always think that one of the things that's critical is to actually get basic data. So as someone who knows about sustainable agriculture, why don't we have good metrics of what sustainability should look like, could look like, that are comparable across countries so we can really say who's on the right trajectory and who's not?
I mean, agriculture is as big as an emitter as the transport energy business, so mea culpa, And it is way behind the fossil fuel industry in terms of regulation, in terms of science, in terms of understanding. It's not really correct that it's not measured. It's probably the most researched industry on earth. I run a little software company called Map of Agriculture, which has extraordinary data on the tomato growth rates in Romania. We have the data. But we are a very politically powerful industry, and we're a very fragmented industry. It's much easier to get the heads of a whole lot of oil companies into a room and knock their heads together than it is to get a bunch of really stubborn libertarian farmers into a room and say, please change your behavior. So it's slightly with my industry in mind that I made the comments earlier about platforms. And it's one of the reasons why we're setting up Map of Agriculture.
Isn't some of the problem with agriculture that we're likely, especially under the pressure of what's being invoked as growing population and the need for growing food supply as areas of the world like Bangladesh and the Nile Valley lose their food generating capacity? Isn't the problem that we're likely to go into more and more of a petro-intensive agriculture rather than a radically redistributed form of agriculture in terms of the green leaf? In other words, what we're getting, certainly on the continent of Africa, as a trend, is a series of land grabs where international capital is buying up huge surfaces of land in order to petro-intensively cultivate them for export, increasing the long-distance trade in foodstuffs. That means the petroleum content of every piece of food generated in this manner is increasing, not decreasing. We're getting more and more people depending upon fewer and fewer varieties of crops grown on bigger and bigger surfaces further and further away from where they're being consumed. That's a recipe for collective collapse because it's dependent upon increasing amounts of a non-renewable petroleum. I'm
going to stop you there. I thank you for that. Is there any other I think it's an outstanding point. I just can't add to it. And I just wonder whether there's any current scholars that it's really interesting to me to come to Rhodes House and hear about social entrepreneurship a lot. And I think it's fantastic. I also think it's slightly scary because as a social entrepreneur myself, I mean, it is really difficult out there. I'd just be interested to hear any stories or any current, I don't know, Charles, you must talk to a lot of current scholars that are doing social entrepreneurship. And I suppose what I was hoping to achieve over this lunch was just to slightly formalize some of the things that I've faced and had to learn, because how can we as a Rhodes community do a better job of supporting social entrepreneurs? That's perhaps the note that I would like to get some comments on and perhaps end on.
Well, I think your point about mentoring is really important, and it really kind of goes to Charles' point, too, about, I mean, it used to be called noblesse oblige, a phrase much out of fashion, but a sense of responsibility, and you mentioned it yourself about the privilege of education, and how does one take that as a responsibility to use that and to mentor others. And I think some is to inculcate a sense of responsibility even in the small things, like in the day-to-day, taking that time to listen, or taking that time to help somebody else who's slightly junior to you, so that you get in the habit of doing that. And that then provides networks and provides habits, because some of it is about habits. And people who grew up in households or cultures in which people didn't do that, they were the first generation to do X, Y, Z, maybe they don't have that habit. And so the Rhodes could play a really important part in having that be part of the culture, is that you are expected to do this. It's required of you, or at least anticipated.
Thank you, and I'm going to thank you for that. It was great, and I'm going to just slightly disagree with the sequencing of something you said in a moment. But I just wonder if there's any current scholars that would have anything that we could perhaps add around social entrepreneurship before we come back to that really helpful point. Are there any social entrepreneurs in the room? Come on, Joanna, what are you doing?
Well, I do have a thought, but it was actually piggybacking the point on mentorship, and that is actually curating or cultivating better access to support from older scholars. I think we do have a platform online now, but it's a little vague as to, indicating, who's a social entrepreneur in my field, who can answer these questions that I have. And so I think we're beginning to address that through, events like this, or we have our Rhodes Venture Forum coming up in June, where I think we'll be building that community further, where it'll become easier to connect and discuss these issues. And I think, and where that mentorship can evolve. And I feel personally that's what I want more of a need more of, but haven't sort of jumped the gun into to accessing it, because the hurdle has just sort of felt, not discouraged me, but I just, I'm in a happy place right now. I didn't feel like putting energy into doing it. And if that could be facilitated a little bit, then it'll be helpful. Access.
Any other current scholars that are social entrepreneurs or thinking of being one that want to make any comments? And then perhaps we can wrap up around those.
Hi, I'm Robin Rotman. I'm not actually a current scholar, but I just wanted to have a follow-up really to what Elizabeth said. So I'm from the class of 2004, so maybe solidly like mid-career at this point. Sitting here with Dan Esty, who's been a mentor of mine for many years. And I think that when you're more junior in your career, there can be just a reluctance to reach out to people who could be helpful to you, because you feel like it's so one-sided, or what could I possibly have that could help them? Oh, he's really busy. I wouldn't want to bother him with asking for advice. And now that I'm beginning to be at a point in my career where people maybe are reaching out to me, I think it's just important to remember that you always have something to offer, and you could be much more junior to somebody, but you can still be a sounding board for ideas. Maybe you could have contacts that you could share. So I think within the Rhodes community, and I suffer from it too, there's, like the imposter syndrome, like this will be the day that they find out they really shouldn't have given me the money or whatever. So to have confidence when you approach somebody else in the community that you are coming from a position where you can, when you can add support.
Any other? Well, that was sort of, I completely agree with that. I mean, my first company, we had a board of directors that was when I was in my early 40s, where I was too shy to ask anybody to be on the board. The map of agriculture, we're gonna be asking former Secretary of States of Agriculture of the United States of America to be on our board. And they're probably going to say, I'm kind of interested. It's amazing how many people out there, if you just go and ask them, will be interested. You've got the best calling card, one of the best calling cards, this institution. So, but unfortunately, you do have, this point about selling. Selling takes courage. You know, on one of my first days at Harvard Business School, full of these supposedly capitalist warriors, we were asked to put up our hands if the following words described us. And it was, you know, aggressive, extroverted, da-da-da. I mean, 90% of the class put up their hand when they were asked perfectionist, you know. And that was at Harvard. And I see it even more here at the Rhodes community. You've got some very humble people. And actually, you've got amazing opportunities, but you have to overcome that humility and actually have a bit of cheek, which is roughly what you were saying, I think. Because, so be bold, you know, and that takes courage. But actually, life takes courage. Your point was great. I'm just going to accept it. Anything else? Otherwise, I think presumably I've taken up my time. That's great. Thanks very much.